What is the most gut-wrenching thing a loved one has done to you? We were stupid teenagers. The both of us. We met in the park down the street from my house after talking to each other online for a few days. One day, we talked about who we were and got to know each other. In 2 weeks we were dating. We had a wonderful relationship together, with a lot of happy and beautiful memories. I was in love with her, and even after it happened, I believed that we'd be together forever. She had a lot of problems with her parents. Her father was a dunce who was never around and stole money from her mother so that he could support his drinking problem. Her mother was a substance abuser who neglected all 3 of her children and made money from selling substances. All of this was not from word of mouth either. I saw all of this happen firsthand, and yet, I never knew about it when I first met her. At first glance, she was a sweet and kind girl who didn't know any better than the life outside of the house she lived in. She never told me about anything that was going on until after we were dating. Growing up, I had an abusive father who would do all sorts of nasty things to our family, which caused my mom and I to move away from Mississippi to a new home in Australia. So in this way, I could understand her situation. When I learned more about her, I figured I could help her somehow avoid her horrible family life. In a way, I thought of it as fixing myself by wanting to help her out with her problems, which buried me deeper into the relationship. She began inviting me over to her house, to watch movies. I'd invite her over to mine to share stories, and I'd take her out to the park to get away from her home life. We would hug and kiss a lot, and it was a joy. Eventually, we started getting more and more intense. It was fun. I was 16 and I had never been with a girl like that before, so it bonded me closer with her. This continued and we kept seeing each other like this for several months. She was a virgin as well, and so neither of us knew what we were doing, which made it all the more memorable. On Valentine's Day we bought each other gifts. Then we went to her house together and decided that both of us were ready to lose our virginity to each other, and so we did. Everything was going great. I got a job, good grades at school, and an awesome new life in Australia away from my dad. I was happy. Then one day, my girlfriend's dad came back. And once he came back, he stayed. She expressed to me in private about how nervous she was for him to come back. I remember first meeting him. He was very skinny and pale with long wavy, greasy hair. He shook my hand and told me it was nice to meet me. He didn't prove to be any better than my own dad. One day, a few months later, my girlfriend appeared in front of my house, sobbing. I ran outside and held her as she cried on my shoulder and told me he finally did it, he finally hit me. As if she was expecting it all along. I was furious. After that, she changed, like someone flipping the switch to a light bulb. It was as if she turned into a whole different person. She began listening to heavier, darker music, she became more depressed, she stopped coming to school, and she wanted more intimacy. One day, she didn't come over to my house in the morning so we could go to school. I was going to go by myself when I got the hunch that I should go to her house instead, even though I'd be totally late for class. I went over to her house and was greeted at the door by her mother, who showed me to her room. She was laying there, asleep under the sheets in her dimly lit room. Though she looked quiet and peaceful, I could feel that she was broken. I was going to wake her up, but after seeing her, I decided to just lay in the bed and hold her for a while. As soon as I wrapped my arms around her, she held my hand and caressed it. She had been awake for a while now. I felt so sorry for her. She was usually always so ironically happy, but now she was the quietest I've ever seen her. We lay there for about 8 minutes and then I told her, come on, it's time to go to school, and pulled her out of bed. She groaned and told me that she didn't want to go, that she wanted to lay in bed all day and cry. I told her that school is better than this old house, and finally, she agreed and got up. A few weeks later, we were on a date in the park. I remember we were laying on the ground looking up at the trees and talking when suddenly she jumped on top of me, straddling me and looking into my eyes, flirting with me. I looked back at her, confused, and I remember matching her gaze when something clicked. I realized that I was not looking at the same girl I had met 6 months ago. Her father hitting her had changed her beyond recognition. She wanted to fool around in the park, something that she would never normally do. I could tell she was hurting inside. Broken. Trying to find some way to cope. I knew what she wanted was unhealthy. So I said no, and we packed up our bags and left. I walked her home and she invited me inside for a bit. We went straight into her room, and right away she slammed the door shut and pushed me down onto the bed. I laughed as she climbed onto me. I thought she was joking. That is, until she started to unbutton my pants, then it got serious. I pushed her off and told her to wait. I could tell that this time was different from all the other times we had done it. She didn't want to do it out of love, but rather out of pain. I could tell she was hurting, crying out for help, and this was her way of dealing with it. I knew it was unhealthy, so I told her no, this isn't right, and walked to the door. She pushed me down onto the bed again and got on top of me. If you love me, you'll let me do this, she said, as she started pulling off my pants. I immediately realized how insane that sounded and stopped her again. Whoa. Hold on, stop. We can't do this right now, I'm going to be late. And yet she continued. I pushed her off of me once more, and she yelled at me, come on, I'm really stressed out, I need this. Stop being so difficult. Finally, she was on me once more, and so I just let her have her way. I didn't know what else to do. I felt so powerless and so ashamed. The whole time I said nothing and I didn't look her in the eye. And I have never told anyone about it except my best friend, who told me that it wasn't good, that it was SA. That's right, I am a guy who was SA'd by a girl. Since then I haven't told anyone this. Not even my parents know about it, and I don't think they would believe me either. I was so ashamed about it, not only because I am a guy and guys usually don't let this happen to them, but also because it was someone that I loved and trusted. Afterward, we were never intimate again. A few weeks later, she started sleeping over at my house. She had told the police about her dad, and so she had to stay away from him for 2 weeks. On the way home, she told me about a guy she was seeing. I joked with her about Peter and that maybe she should buy a drink for him, which I shouldn't have said. She started yelling at me all the way home, pleading that she is not cheating on me with him and that I should trust her more, so I apologized. The next 2 weeks, she started talking more and more to him. She started staying up until 3 a.m. on the phone with him. And whenever I'd go into the living room to give her a kiss on the cheek or to talk to her, she'd always ask for more privacy. Originally I thought nothing about it until she started hanging out with him and I got an eerie feeling. I asked her and she would always say, "You should trust me more, don't you trust me?" Then we'd fight, something we had never done. To which I'd apologize and then feel bad for asking her about it in the first place. The fights got worse, and I got worried. One night I went to talk to her about her day, and she kept talking about Peter, and all the great things about him. So I asked her, "Is there anything about your day that doesn't have to do with Peter?" She dragged me into the kitchen and screamed at me like never before. The whole time I got flashes of my dad. I felt like I was being yelled at by him. I knew this was not the same girl whom I had fallen in love with. Something completely different. I felt like I had failed to help her, to be there for her, and to support her. I had done all that I could and now she was dead inside. And to tell you the truth, as I was looking at her face, screaming at me, I began to die inside as well. The next day, on the way home from school, we walked up to the front door of my house. I stopped us, then turned around and confronted her. I told her that I wasn't okay with what she was doing to me. I told her how I felt and that I wanted this to work out, but I was tired of getting taken advantage of. Then she turned around and left. She came back 30 minutes later and told me that she was going to be staying somewhere else. She told me that I was just like her dad, that me confronting her scared her and she couldn't be around me anymore. Guess where she stayed? That's right. Peter's. Later on, she broke up with me. I felt so horrible and yet at the same time so ironically free. In my pain, I self-destructed, and after she told me I marched into my shed and started to punch the punching bag with my bare knuckles. I had never exploded in anger before after being in pain, but at that moment I punched the bag hard. And then kept punching and never stopped. With each hit, I would grunt louder and louder, until the grunting turned into screaming, and the screaming turned into crying. I kept punching more and more until blood began to trickle down my arms. After 5 minutes, I collapsed onto the floor sobbing, holding the bag to my forehead. And that's where my mom and stepdad found me. It was something I had never done before all my life. I wore bandages around both my fists for a few months. After that, our relationship didn't blossom again for a long time. And after a while, my now ex-girlfriend told me that yeah, she was cheating on me with Peter, but they weren't talking to each other anymore. At that, I told her I understood, because I knew she was in pain and she agreed. Then we agreed to get back together again after we repaired ourselves. I grew hopeful and thought that maybe there was a chance that she'd be back to her old self. Stupid me. We flirted back and forth with each other, and my mom warned me that things didn't seem right with her and that I should wait, so I did. I gave her time to heal, all while we talked to each other and became friends. One day she told me straight to my face that she had been sleeping around with another man. She told me that she was sorry, but after that, I woke up and realized that this wasn't right. I cut her out of my life and we stopped talking to each other. She talked about me behind my back, telling her friends that I would beat her or yell at her. I was so confused. I always loved her and respected her as much as I could, and yet she was saying those things about me. It got worse a few months later when I got a new girlfriend and her friends would follow me home from school. Then one day, she texted me that she didn't want me to see my new girlfriend anymore, and when I told her that we both have our own lives she threatened to kill me. After that, we never talked to each other ever again, and still to this day we never talk. Recently I sent her a letter, telling her I forgive her for all the things she did to me, but she never replied or even mentioned it. Now I am 18 years old and I am almost done with high school. I am single and have been for about a year. The relationship with my second girlfriend didn't work out because I was still broken from my time with the first one. It has taken me a year and a half to talk about this. I am still embarrassed about everything that's happened. Has your ex ever come to you begging for forgiveness? I absolutely loved my last girlfriend. Her name was Jess. We were engaged and set to live a very happy life together. However, there was always one guy who I was kind of insecure about as she always made jokes about how attractive he was. Well, our wedding came around and everything was planned. The wedding was literally 4 days away. However, the guy who I was insecure about was in town, and newly single, as declared on his social media. I woke up the morning 4 days until my wedding to find a note stapled to my fridge. It was very long, 6 pages to be exact. The letter explained that she is sorry for bailing on the wedding when it is so close, but Jason is back in town, and she is sick and tired of hiding their love. She confessed to cheating on me with him for months before this and said the guilt had caught up to her and she no longer live with it. Her and Jason were moving to a different state and she told me she is changing her number and to never call her again. My entire world shattered, and I drowned myself with alcohol and substances over the next year. However, over time I was able to stand back up on my feet. However, all of this left a permanent hole in my heart. 2 whole years later my doorbell rang. Standing there was Jess, in tears. She said how sorry she was, and how she wanted me to take her back. She gave me the biggest ever sob story. They dated for 2 years, and told me Jason repeatedly laid hands on her severely, and showed me a scar he left on her neck. He stole all her money and got her pregnant, then left without a word and she has no idea where he is. She told me she now has a 3-month-old son and would love it if I could give her another chance. She then word for word, asked me to be the child's dad. I thought about it, and every part of me wanted to just say yes, as I love this woman more than everything. However, I could not let history pass. So I invited her in, effed her for the whole day, then at nighttime kicked her out and told me to never call me again. I found out what my 8-year-old son was saving up for. It destroyed me. When I was 16 years old, I was stupid. I didn't wear protection and I got a girl pregnant. I was shocked. I never expected to have a kid that early. I didn't know if I regretted it or not. Almost all of my regrets washed away when my son was born. For privacy purposes, we will call him Rory. I am 24 now, and my son is almost 8. He is the smartest and most loving kid I could ever ask for. His mom left when he was around 2. When I tried to sue for child support, the judge sided with her, stating that I was the father and needed to step up. Ever since then, it has been me and Rory against the world. I have been a single dad to Rory since then. I have had a few girlfriends, but nothing serious. I left my parents' place and got a small apartment. I dropped out of high school, which I still immensely regret, but hey, life happens. During this time, my neighbors helped me raise my son. They were an older couple next door whose kids had moved out long before, so they were fine with babysitting him after school and during late shifts. I am a manager at McDonald's. I make lousy money, but it is enough to get by. Then, 2 years ago, our terrible building manager raised the rent for everyone. I had to work even harder to find a place to live during a pandemic. My parents had left the state, and I wasn't ready to uproot my kid's entire life just because his dad couldn't provide for him. Every birthday, since before he was 3, I took Rory to Golden Corral. Usually it was on his birthday, but there were other occasions when we went. It was really good for him, and he really enjoyed it. I hadn't been able to take him for the past 2 years due to money being very tight. Sometimes I get tipped at McDonald's. A quarter here, a dime here, a dollar here and there. I'll always bring it to him every day and give it to Rory to save. Well, 2 days ago, Rory brought me his money jug and dumped it all out in front of me. He was so excited and began counting it out. There was around $40 there, and he jumped up excitedly. I asked him what was up, little buddy. Let me tell you guys, my heart broke. At that moment, my son asked me if it was enough to go to Golden Corral for his birthday in a month. A piece of me shattered inside. I didn't think he remembered Golden Corral. I told him we could go to the bank tomorrow and exchange it for cash. That night, I ugly cried in my bedroom. I felt like a failure because I couldn't give him everything he's ever wanted. I've begun researching furthering my education. Yesterday, as soon as the bank opened, I took my son, and we exchanged the money for cash. I then drove us to Golden Corral, despite it not being his birthday just yet. We were there for 2 hours. We got the all-you-can-eat buffet and it was 2 for $30. My kid was so happy, and I was stupid because I just assumed he forgot about this place. Today, I cried again in my room. I've never been good at saving money, but his birthday is next month, and I'm going to do my best to take him every few months. I refused to pay for my stepdaughter's wedding. My wife passed away when my sons were 7 and 4. Since then, I remarried and my new wife and I have been married for 12 years now. She herself was married before and had a daughter of her own from her own past marriage. Her ex-husband's story is its own saga. He's alive but isn't in their life anymore. When we married, my sons were 13 and 8, and my stepdaughter was 13. For 12 years, I tried to form a relationship. I would get her gifts and try to make sure she always got what she wanted. I did everything I could to make her happy. I would drive her to school, be at her extracurriculars. I paid for the nicest private schools for her I could. I worked day and night so I could give her the lifestyle she deserved. I tried my best and treated her just like my sons, but she continued to hate me. There was a sight at you and when my stepdaughter graduated. While my eldest son had invited my wife to his graduation, my stepdaughter refused to invite me. She had 2 tickets, but she only invited her mother. When I questioned her, all she said was, "You're not my dad, you didn't raise me, and I don't want you in my life." I was heartbroken. I tried very hard for her to like me but she hated me. Still I paid for her college along with both my sons. Nevertheless, a few months back, she informed my wife that she will be getting married. I only found out when my wife told me. It was even more devastating when she said she would come home to celebrate, and I brought a cake, and balloons and so much more. Then, last minute, she changed plans. She just told my wife that my wife should come over to her apartment, without my sons and I. I was shattered. When I did eventually call to congratulate her, she just tried to end the conversation as quickly as she could. The last thing I had asked was maybe the honor to have a father-daughter dance with her, which she shot down immediately. I said nothing, but then came the bill and my wife said she needed some money for her wedding. I considered it long and hard, but clearly as she didn't consider me as her father, I said I would not be paying for her wedding. I told my wife that she had money saved up, it was her choice to use that if she wanted, but I would not be paying for her wedding. She was furious at me. She said she barely had any money saved up and I was being an awful person. I have received calls from all of my wife's family telling me that I should pay. The whole thing has become a mess. It has divided our family but I am still holding my ground. My father shared a secret with me that ruined my entire life. My father told me this story over drinks the other night. He'd gotten a little tipsy and ended up telling me something that unraveled a dark truth about my uncle. When I was 7, I remember Uncle Mark always being my favorite relative. He always invited me around to show me his airsoft gun collection, have hide-and-seek parties with my friends and even took us to the beach. He would always come with sweets for us and acted like one of us, another child who just wanted to have fun. But then came the day when everything seemed to fall apart. Looking back, my uncle had told me we were going to go to the new amusement park that had opened up on the other side of town. I was so excited as I had been waiting for so long to have a chance to visit that place. My dad was happy and cheerful for the entire day. He was going on about how much he loved the fact his brother wanted to be in his children's life, and was excited to let me go to the new park. That was until his phone rang. I was in my room, packing my stuff when I heard the most blood-curdling scream from my dad. He was yelling at someone on the phone, louder than I had ever. I heard him rip open our front door and slam it back shut with enough force to make the picture next to it fall off the wall. I didn't see my dad for a long while after that. He never told me why until we had this talk, but that shall be explained at the end. My mom had a lot of money saved up from a minor lotto win, so we were alright financially. She kept assuring us, "Your father is just away for a while because he was looking after you and your siblings." Uncle Mark didn't come that day. We did see him around town, but he always ran away as soon as my mom saw him waving at me. 9 months later, my father came home and I excitedly ran and hugged him. He hugged me right back, and that night we had a party to celebrate his return. A week or so later, Dad sat me down with the other children and explained that Uncle Mark wouldn't be coming around anymore. When I asked why, he just said Uncle Mark was a bad person and that if he ever tried to talk to us, we were to ignore him and come find one of them. We all agreed because my dad knew best. A year or so later, I was leaving school, and was waiting for my parents to pick me up when I saw Uncle Mark. He had a huge grin on his face and began approaching me. I was nervous to see him after what my dad had told me. He said he was here to pick me up. I told him I couldn't go with him, because my father said I wasn't allowed to speak with him. That's when Uncle Mark's tone seemed to change in an instant. He had this scary look on his face for a second, then he told me it was all good. He said he had spoken to my father about the situation, and that my father had changed his mind and asked him to pick me up from school that day. When I refused further, he grabbed my hand and began leading me towards his truck. Luckily for me, this was right as my father had arrived to pick me up from school. My dad ran up and punched Mark right in the face, blood spewing out of his mouth. I didn't see much after that except Uncle Mark running away with my dad chasing him. My dad came back after a little while, sighed and took me in for a hug. He told my mother to take me home, and that he'd see us later. He was lying, and I knew it would be a long time before I saw my father again. 5 years. 5 years my dad was gone. Sometime during this time period, my mom had admitted to us that he was in prison for protecting us. We all knew it was likely because he hurt Uncle Mark. We didn't know at that time, but Uncle Mark liked kids. A lot. The day I was meant to go to the amusement park, my aunt, Mark's wife, had called my dad. She told him she'd found pictures under their bed of children and she was scared of what to do. Mark was a large man, and she later revealed that she was too scared to call the police as Mark had been abusing her for years. My father rushed over to their house that day and smashed in the door to find Uncle Mark screaming at my aunt as she waved the pictures around in hysterics. That day, my dad had beaten Uncle Mark within an inch of his life. The entire time my father was being arrested by police, Mark was screaming that he was going to make my father pay for what he'd done. The worst part was, by the time my dad had explained why he had done it, Mark managed to gather all the pictures, and incinerated them all. He also scared my aunt into saying nothing, so there was no evidence to use against him. My dad was sent to prison for assault, but made sure my other uncles and older cousins were around to protect us in case Mark came back. For the duration of my father's sentence, Mark didn't try anything. He waited until my dad thought we were safe. Come the day after school. It turns out Mark had come to kidnap me from right under their noses. And who would stop him? Nobody believed my dad when he explained who Mark truly was. They assumed he was just excusing himself for attacking him. After all, the police hadn't found anything and his wife said my dad was a liar. All they saw was my nice uncle here to pick me up. Unfortunately, my father was there. Luckily for Mark, he had a chance to escape, as my father had tripped while chasing him. But my dad knew where he would go. He knew Uncle Mark would run home to hide, and more than likely destroy any evidence he had acquired since destroying the last lot. He also knew the police would be on his tail for the attack on the school, so he didn't have long. Sadly for Mark, my father was in a car, and he was on foot. He drove over and demanded to know if my aunt was going to lie again, after what Uncle Mark had just tried to pull. She said she wouldn't stop my dad or save Mark this time. My dad ordered her to get all the evidence she could as he waited for Mark to appear. She came back down with pictures. Lots of pictures. He then told her to go, wait 1 hour and then call the police. He was ending this. And as Uncle Mark appeared, my dad, who had been waiting behind the wall of his garden, slammed him through the door of his house. He then proceeded to beat him to death in his doorway. By the end, he could no longer see the floor through the blood. My dad was arrested on murder and did so without resistance, only saying he wished the police had done his job for him. When the true nature of Mark was revealed to the court, my father was instead charged for manslaughter, rather than murder. His lawyer stated my father had gone into a protective rage and had only intended to render him harmless. No one seemed to argue with these charges, including my father. He said he didn't regret it, but that he wished he had done something else purely so that he didn't miss out on so much of our lives. After hearing the story, I was very grateful my father didn't tell me about this when I was younger. I know now I would not have been able to handle all of that, and this only made me prouder of my father. What story sounds fake but is 100% true? Charles Holden was on his way home from work when he decided to stop at a fast food restaurant near his house in Harrington, Delaware. After grabbing a quick bite to eat, Charles left the store and got back into his truck. He turned it on, and he was about to drive out of the lot when he stopped. There was this man running towards him, waving, trying to flag him down. Charles put his truck back in park, and he rolled his window down to see what this guy wanted. And when this stranger got close enough, he told Charles that his sister was having a baby, and he needed a ride to the hospital, which was about 20 minutes away. Charles couldn't tell if this guy was lying. It was super late. He didn't know this guy, and he just had a bad feeling about him. And so he told him, "No, I'm sorry. It's too late. I got to go home. It's too far out of the way." The stranger immediately looked dejected and turned around, starting to walk away. And as Charles was watching him go, he felt bad and said, "You know what? Hey, come back here. I'll give you a ride part of the way there." And so the stranger smiled, hopped in his passenger seat, and they took off. Charles drove him approximately 3 miles in the direction he had asked to go before pulling over on the side of the road and telling him, "This is as far as I'm going to take you." Charles lived only about a block away, and he didn't want to drive too far away from home so late at night. But the stranger, upon hearing he was being let out so soon, suddenly became angry. He began fumbling in his pocket like he was going to get a knife or some sort of weapon. And he started screaming at Charles, "Hand over your keys. Hand over your wallet, or I'm going to kill you." Charles, meanwhile, was on edge just being in the car with this guy because he had a bad feeling about him. He immediately jumped into action. He turned off his truck, ripped the keys out of the ignition, and leapt out of his truck. Charles saw a convenience store in the distance and went on his way to get help. As he was running, he turned around and saw the stranger had also leapt out of the car and was now sprinting up to him with a screwdriver in his hand. This stranger was running really fast. He was gaining on Charles. Soon, Charles realized he wasn't going to make it to the convenience store before this guy caught up to him. So at some point, Charles just stopped. He turned around and put his hands up, saying, okay, I'll give you a ride wherever you want to go. And then you can have my keys, my wallet. You can have anything you want." So the stranger ran right up to Charles, stopped, and smiled because he was very pleased with this result. He poked him with the screwdriver and gestured for him to go back to the truck. So Charles walked back to the truck with the stranger right behind him, periodically poking him in the back with the screwdriver. They finally reached the vehicle, and the stranger told Charles to get in the car and then wait. As Charles sat down, he fired up his truck and sped off before the stranger could hop in the passenger side door. He saw the stranger at some point stop, turn around, and walk away. Charles was totally relieved that he had escaped this horrible encounter. He was thinking about calling the police, but ultimately decided he wouldn't because it was his decision to allow some stranger to get in his car in the middle of the night. Charles was concerned about where he had ditched the stranger. It was not far from his house, and he was worried that if he just turned around and drove right back to his house, this guy could recognize the truck and then follow him to his house. Who knows what could happen? Charles decided he was just going to stay outside of town and drive around for a while to make sure this stranger was long gone by the time he came back. After about an hour of doing just that, Charles went back into Harrington, Delaware. He got on his street and was shocked when he saw the stranger who had just tried to kill him walking down the road right in front of him. But luckily, the stranger did not hear or see Charles pull onto his street. So Charles immediately threw it in reverse and drove off. At this point, Charles decided he needed to tell the police because he didn't know if this stranger actually knew him and maybe he was targeting him, waiting for him at his property. So he called 911. He told the dispatcher about what had happened earlier and how this guy was now lurking around his property. The dispatcher told him they would send an officer out to him. A few minutes later, an officer showed up at the payphone where Charles was, and they told Charles they would escort him back to his property. If this stranger was still in the area, they would arrest him. When they got there, the stranger was long gone. Charles went into his house. There was no sign of a break-in. There was no sign that anyone was near his property. So Charles thanked the officer. He was relieved. But before the officer left, he asked him if he wouldn't mind doing a quick sweep of his mother's property. She lived right behind Charles on the other side of some bushes. He told the officer her name was Dorothy. She was 70 years old, and she lived alone. He just wanted to make sure nothing happened to her. The officer said, "No problem. I'll go check on her." So the officer left Charles and went across his backyard, through those bushes, into Dorothy's backyard. Right away, he could see the back window on the back door had been smashed, and the door itself was slightly ajar. So the officer drew their pistol, went up, and entered the house. They looked inside, yelling for Dorothy, but there was no answer. It was totally dark in the house. It was totally silent. After searching the first floor and finding nothing, they made their way up the flight of stairs. They found blood at the top of the landing. They followed this trail of blood, which led them into one of the bedrooms, where a woman was sprawled out on a bed. It was Dorothy. She had been stabbed to death. It would turn out that after Charles had ditched the stranger and sped off without him, the stranger, whose name was Gilbert Cannon, began looking for a place to sleep. And the house he ultimately selected just happened to be Charles's mother's house. After Gilbert broke in through her back door, he saw Dorothy coming down the steps to confront him. And because he was worried she'd be able to identify him, he attacked her with a screwdriver. Gilbert would later tell the police that the attack on Charles was completely random. He was just at this fast food restaurant, saw Charles get into his truck, and thought to himself, if I can get in that guy's truck, I bet I can rob him. And then after this failed robbery, when Gilbert was out looking for a place to sleep and he broke into this house and a woman came down the stairs, he attacked and killed her. He had no idea that this woman, Dorothy, was Charles's mother. The entire night was one big, horrible coincidence. Gilbert would plead guilty to the murder and would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. What's the most horrifying and evil thing you've seen an adult do to a child? I live in Tokyo, Japan with my wife and 4-year-old son Kenji. I'm a white American, but my wife is Japanese. We have lived here since he was born, but he is still sometimes treated differently due to being half white. My son was 2 years old when this happened. We got on a relatively crowded train one day. Only going a few stops. My son was in a very friendly stage where he would say hello to anyone who looked at him. We were standing by the door with my son holding my hand as the train pulled into the next station. Two businessmen in suits got on the train talking about a meeting they had just gotten out of. They were rather tall and caught my son's eye. He looked up with a big smile on his face and watched them as they spoke. It would seem that being watched by the 2-year-old bothered one of the men, perhaps due to my son being half white. After a minute the businessman looked down at my son. "Konnichiwa," my son said to the man with a smile on his face. The events that happened next happened so quickly that it all felt like a single moment. The man, without skipping a beat, kicked my 2-year-old right in the chest with a kick that forced my son's hand out of my own and knocked him against the door. His coworker said nothing. Completely unaware of what had just happened, and as pure as any 2-year-old child would be, my son got up, grabbed my hand, looked at the man again, and tried to smile. It was at this moment that I tried to pick up my son and get away from the man, but before I could do this, the man moved in and kicked my son again with even greater force. The train's door had just opened for the next stop. There was a gap between the train and the platform. My son's leg fell in. He started to scream and panic. Someone pushed the emergency button. People started to scramble to get away from the scene. And then I witnessed true evil. Both the man and his coworker were laughing hysterically at my toddler son stuck between the train and the platform. With the help of a few strangers, my wife and I managed to get our son up and out to safety. My wife picked him up and ran for the station office to get staff or police to help. I wanted nothing more than to beat that man within an inch of his life, but I would surely be deported if I did something like that because I was a foreigner. Holding back more rage than any one person should ever have to feel in their life, and honestly in shock about what had just happened, I got off the train and followed my wife and son. We filed a report with the police, but they didn't seem interested in pursuing the case since my son wasn't hurt in a serious way. Now, my sister's brother-in-law owned and operated a chain of bars, and as a result, had a strong relationship with the Yakuza. My marriage had been a bit controversial in some parts of my wife's family because I was a foreigner, but me and my brother-in-law had always got along well and he loved his nephew. When me and my wife told him about what had happened, he just told me he would handle it. I didn't ask any questions. We didn't speak about the incident for over a year, but one night when we were both drinking pretty heavily and deep in conversation, I asked him what he did to handle the situation. He proceeded to tell me, in Japanese, "Well, you told me he kicked little Kenji, and my associates decided that he should never be able to do that again, so they broke both of his legs."